This video is part 2 of a series on perspective. In the first video, we covered blocking in our building shapes, and in this video, we're going to shadow them, render them, and get all the final detail in. I'm David Finch, and I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and share with your friends. If you have any comments, leave them below, and if you have any questions about the tools that I use, please look in the description below. All right, so we're gonna jump right in. What I'm doing right now is I'm starting to use line weight and some slight negative space just to get started. Sometimes it can be really difficult for me to just jump right into heavy shadow and blocking in large areas, and I kind of like to just start with something a little bit more simple. So I've got this lit from the left, and with that in mind, it's just above and to the left. And with that in mind, I'm lighting the underside of my sills, the underside of the top roof sill there. I've got some blocks underneath the sill, and so I'm going thicker with the shadow where the blocks aren't, and then thinner with the shadow where they are, and that gives the illusion of them being a three-dimensional shape. And so now I'm gonna go ahead and get some detail in on my chimneys. Even with this just small amount of lighting, I'm starting to get a bit more of a sense, and I'm broadening out. I've got a water tower up here. Underneath the water tower, there's a bit of a lattice structure, and so I'm drawing shadows in between the beams, and I want to light shadow the right side of the water tower. I'm going thinner with it as it goes around, so I start with a thicker line, and then as the slats go, the lighting on the slats gets thinner and thinner. Now I'm drawing a window that is facing directly away from the light, so this entire building here is just going to be dark, and I like the idea of making this building dark because the one behind it is light. And so with that building dark, it separates from the building in front of it. I'm jumping around just a little bit, and this is something, I do this all the time. In order to get a picture that's kind of working cohesively for me, and if I'm thinking on the page, I'll just jump around. So I got my chimneys drawn in, the shadow on the right side of the chimneys. I want to make sure that they work with the building behind it. And so as I darken that in, I don't end up obliterating the chimneys in front of it. So I've got my windows in, I'm working around my chimneys. And for my actual window framing, I'm doing a bit of a negative space. So I'm drawing the shadows underneath the frames, and I'm not really finishing out the frames entirely. And so now I'm going to go ahead, and because I need to have my foreground in before I can finish what's behind it, and I'm really just trying to establish a light over the whole picture. Once I have enough of the picture in, even if it's about a quarter of the picture or so, it gives me enough of an overall sense of my lighting that everything just flows. So it's always a bit of a more difficult process when I'm starting, and since there's no lighting, there's really nothing for me to reference from. Even though I know where I've got my lighting coming from, it can still be just a little bit daunting. I haven't really had a chance to really think through, and I'm actually thinking while I'm moving. So when I think, okay, this area is going to be dark, I'll just jump from one area to another. And so I'm doing the lattice work on top of the front building. Now I'm shoring up, and you'll notice I go much thicker underneath my lines. So I've got a line for the top sill of the roof, and underneath it is much thicker, and the top portion is left much thinner. And this is why I really like doing a cartoon first with no line weights at all, because it means that I can put in my line weights based on my lighting and make it work without fighting with thicker or thinner lines where they're not really appropriate. And I'm going to want these windows to be pretty dark too, the outside of the windows, because again, they're facing away from the light. So I'm just going in and blocking in my shadow, shadowing the front side of my sill or my frame, and just getting the rest of the window consistently lit so it looks like the light's coming from the left-hand side and away from this side of the building. So I'm just making sure to darken in every surface is facing toward the right. And then I'm going to go in and shadow in underneath. Now I've left a bit of a light. You can see it's actually on the underneath side of the little roof peak there, but I'm doing that just really for separation. I'm putting in a like a Venetian blind. It's a detail that can really kind of work to break up a window. It's always a challenge. I find when I have windows, I have a choice. I can either make a building, if it's a nighttime scene, I can make it look like the windows are lit by keeping them light and then keeping the building around the outside of the building dark, and that gives you that illusion. But if I want it to look like more of a daytime scene, I make sure to go darker with the window on the inside, and I can put reflections on the glass, and there are different tricks that I can use, and I'll use a bunch of those as I go along here. And so for this window, I'm putting in more of a solid blind, and so I'm going dark below it after I erase a little bit here. And I'm getting my sill drawn in nice and dark underneath. All of my shapes need to have a shape in three-dimensional space, so I'm just drawing the undersides. I'm putting a shadow on the undersides of all my shapes. And so it's just a matter of going through this whole building and making sure that things are as consistent as I can make them. But then also, I really want to make sure that it's readable. And so it's always a bit of a push and a pull. I want to make sure that my shadows look consistent and it looks like everything's in the same place, but then I don't want to put a shadow where it's going to obscure things and make things flatten. And that is something that you can achieve just by layering darks on top of lights. And I'll be doing that as I go through this picture. So pay attention as I'm drawing and I'll point it out. But if I have a dark shape, I'm going to try to put a light shape behind it. And if I have light shape, obviously I'm going to try and put a dark shape behind it. And that really is very, very effective for separating out buildings. And it can be a bit of a challenge when you're starting to get that effect going and also have a consistent lighting and not fight it. But that's why you really want to try to plan when you're starting a light source that is going to give you that effect. And so that's why I had my lighting coming from the left. I chose that direction because I thought I would be able to take the right sides of all my buildings on the left hand side here, and that's where I'm starting, and make them dark, and therefore the front of the building would be light, and as a result it gives me a natural light onto dark onto light onto dark. And so I'm drawing the side of my mid-ground building, and I'm making that nice and dark, and it's already separating out quite a bit and pushing it back to the front of the building, and just continuing my shadow down the side of the rest of the building, maintaining the same shapes that I used on the floors above. Architecture is very repetitive, so you end up drawing floor after floor of really the same thing, and it just requires a bit of patience. And I'm just going in and shoring up my details. Everything's drawn in very lightly, and I tend to press a little harder at this point, and I want those windows to be recessed, so I'm drawing a bit more of a shadow above them, and that pushes them back. And I'm just trying to make sure to be consistent from window to window as I go along. And it's just a matter of being patient. I know I keep saying you have to be patient, but it really is a major part of the job. And now, because this window that I just drew there, I want it to look like it's darker inside. I just drew a cast shadow actually inside the window itself. And so I'm layering dark and light for my shapes on top of the building there. I've got some chimneys and just some little detail. And as long as I'm consistent, I have the right side of them dark and the front light, they naturally separate out. I'm adding a little bit of crack detail on the stonework between the windows, and then just cleaning up some of my lines and making sure that all my shapes make sense. Venetian blinds in that one. This one I'm going dark. I really want to change it up and not have every window be exactly the same. It makes it look a little bit more, well, a lot more lived in when you try to think in terms of making each one at least a little bit individual. And this is where reference can actually really help you from life, but also from other artists that do it well. A little bit more shoring up my line weights and adding in some final detail into the stonework before we move on to the rest of the picture. So I'm shadowing in under my blind here. And this is where I'm really jumping around as I draw in the building behind. The building in front is kind of looking a little bit light, and so I just went back in and shored up what I have in the front a little bit. A big part of making things go back in space is having thicker, heavier lines in the foreground and then lighter, thinner lines in the background. And you really want to be very careful about not having very, very thick lines on anything as it goes further back in space, because it will really, really flatten out your image. So you really want to make sure that you're planning, and a great way to do that is just jumping around a little bit. And you know, if the building in the foreground looks like it's not really projecting forward enough, then you just make the lines a little bit thicker on the undersides, places that are away from the light, and you leave the building in the background alone, and it gives you that effect. And so I'm going ahead, those windows in the building that I'm drawing right now, I've drawn the left side of the windowsill or the window edge, and not really the right. I'm shadowing inside the windows a little bit here and just giving them a little bit of detail. I just want it to look like it has some character. It looks a little bit lived in. Continuing down the building here, and just quickly doing the same techniques as I go down. And I needed to have something on that sign, so I just wrote park and put a little arrow on there. When I put signs into buildings, on buildings in cities, I want to make sure to have something that looks believable, but then also something that's not really gonna cause legal issues. So I make sure to not use any kind of names that somebody could have a problem with. It's something that has actually happened to me before. I had a friend that was a restaurant, and I put that into a building on a Batman page, and I ended up having to actually go back in after it was inked and fix it, because they were worried, even though it was a friend, that at some point somebody could sue, and so legal had a problem with it. And that, you know, if you're doing something that's published, is a problem that can come up. And so now as I go into the background here, I'm drawing my much more modern building in the background. I'm going much thinner. I'm still shoring up my lines. I'm going thicker on the underside of those cross pieces, but I'm going much thinner than I would obviously in a building in a foreground. And because these buildings now behind it are behind it, and the building in front there is light, I'm just going dark with these. And it's a choice that it's an obvious choice for me. It really wasn't even something I had to think about. I just make sure to layer dark behind light, or vice versa, at all times. And now I'm feeling like the building, I guess, overall composition on the left-hand side was looking a little bit flat and straight down. So I'm just adding another building, just a bit of a shape back there, just to continue it out, just give it a bit more of a pleasing compositional shape. So I'm doing the same thing here. These are smaller windows. The undersides of those, I'm just showing up with a bit of shadow underneath. And now I'm just putting in some very, very light, because it's far in the background, kind of seam and crack detail. I don't want it to look cracked because it's a newer building, but just, you know, some seams. I made the building on the right-hand side of my more modern building dark, and I'm feeling like, and this is, I actually fought with this a little bit with that little building that I made dark in the bottom of the finished side here, but I wanted to imagine that there's a bit of a cast shadow coming from buildings that are maybe off panel, or maybe it's the buildings that you see there casting onto the newer building, just to give it a bit of dimension. And so I didn't want to go totally dark with it, so I just used a rendered pattern, and that's like a render cast shadow that fades as it goes down. And so now I'm just going in again. All these buildings in the back are going to be pretty dark. I don't want them just to be black, so I'm drawing in my cross pieces and the parts of the buildings that aren't windows dark, and then the windows themselves will be light. And I can create the illusion that there's something inside those buildings just by drawing some dark pieces kind of randomly inside the windows. We'll do that in just a moment here. Got a sign on the other side, on the buildings on the other side of the panel, drawing that in here. And now this other side of the panel is actually a bit more of a challenge, because I've got two surfaces. I've got the surfaces facing directly toward the light, and then the surface facing toward us, which on the other side I made light. And so I'm thinking about it as I go, and I'm thinking the surfaces that are facing directly toward us on the right-hand side of the picture, I'm going to go dark, because I still want to make sure to have a dark and light transition. And so I'm actually cheating my own lighting a little bit in order to achieve that. And so I'm getting my buildings across the back just detailed in using the same techniques again that I was using before. And now I can go ahead and start working on the foreground of the right-hand side. And I'm starting by shoring up all of my block shapes. The side of the blocks that is facing toward the light, I'm shadowing dark, and that dark contrasts with the light, and it just gives it more of a dimension than if I had not done that. It probably would have been more correct for the lighting that I had established, but ultimately I felt like it was consistent enough with what I had on the other side. It didn't fight it explicitly. I wasn't putting shadow directly where the light was facing, so I thought I could get away with it. And that really is a compositional choice that I made there. And so now I'm taking all of the sides of my shapes that are facing toward the viewer and making those dark. And doubling up some of my lines here, I'm creating a bit of a beveled line there. And adding some slight crack detail into my bricks. I'm not going to do a lot of rendering for this one. I wanted this, for the most part, to work just with actual black shadow shapes. And you'll see on that center divider between the two windows, I gave it a bit of a double line there and broke up that line. I really like breaking my lines because it actually looks like the line is being hit by light, and it's not a totally consistent, just perfect, clean line. It gives it a little bit more life. And I really like double lines because it just has more of a realistic look. It's something I use everywhere. I learned it once and it worked, so I use it all over the place. And so I've got a blind in the further window there, and I've shadowed just under the blind. And now this window, it has no blind or anything, so I just went completely dark with that windowed portion there. So it's totally dark in the room behind. I'm going nice and heavy with a shadow underneath that sill there because it projects out pretty far, and so it would cast a heavier shadow. Also, it's closer in the foreground, so I really want my dark shapes, my black shapes, to be thicker for foreground things. It pushes my foreground into the foreground much more effectively than if I went really thin with everything. And I'm just adding some detail and seams into my building. I just think it makes things look a little bit more lived in and maybe real. I don't want perfect shapes that look like they are perfectly sized for their purpose. These are construction materials that come in, maybe specific sizes, and you have to put several together in order to get the finished thing. So I just put seams in. And now I'm doing my mid-ground building, and I'm making sure undersides and sides that are facing away from the light, I'm putting in my line weight along there, and some bricks. Those are relatively small bricks, and what I'm doing with the bricks is changing up my line weights. And I don't want the bricks to be perfect looking. I want the line weights to be thicker and thinner, and it actually gives the illusion of some bricks being slightly more recessed and some popping a little bit more. And for older buildings, so that's pretty effective. Also, you'll notice I used basically a stucco. So what I did is I drew some holes along the side of the wall, just some lines, and then drew bricks in those shapes. And where there aren't bricks, that's like a raised portion of like stucco that's on top of there. And I really like using that because it is an interesting pattern, and it also breaks up drawing just an entire flat wall of bricks, which can really look way too busy. I can actually just fade bricks and just draw a few here and there, and I do that at times too, but I like the stucco look because it gives me that effect in just a different way. And so for these windows here, these small ones, I'm actually really just drawing a negative space, a heavy shadow on the top, and a shadow along the side that's facing away from the light. Now, I did draw that in the cartoon. I drew the other side of the window, so it's not completely empty, but it'd be a very, very, very thin line. And I actually could have gotten away with just drawing the shadows for the windows. And now the lines on this building here, this is a building that's much further away, are going to be quite a bit thinner and more broken up than the lines that are in the foreground there. And the bricks are smaller. Again, you really want to make absolutely sure that you're keeping your detail to scale. And as long as you're really, jumping in and out visually just while you're looking at your picture, that's something you can keep your eye on pretty easily, making sure that everything fits together. And so getting the last bit of my detailing in, top of the building, and we are really getting fairly close to finished with this. It's just some last details and working on line weight just to make sure everything holds together. And getting the front of this building. I missed this building, the portion that's in perspective on the front here, and so I'm drawing in one side of the window and underneath that sill there, and just fading out some of the lines behind it. And it really is using the same basic technique just over and over and over, drawing, knowing where my light is, drawing the sides of objects that are away from the light thicker, the sides of objects that are toward the light I keep very thin, and just repeat that pattern. And I make sure to use darker shadows to separate the buildings as a whole. And so one thing I wanted to add at the end here, and I'm just going to draw a quick picture at the top of this drawing, and this is a problem I see with people's perspective all the time. It's very, very common. And what I've done is I've drawn a building in perspective. It's a 1-point perspective, and it's correct, but I've drawn the building way, way, way too deep. It's too long on the portion that is in perspective, and the windows are actually not getting more narrow as they go back too, so it looks very phony. And now I'm drawing that same building, and I'm making sure to go much, much more narrow with the side in perspective, and the windows are much more narrow. And you can see that even with a very, very simple kind of marshmallow drawing, it looks much more correct. So if you have that problem, that really is all it is, and it's a very easy fix. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Next week, we're going to be doing legs. I'm excited for that. And make sure to come by for Sunday's live stream. It's at 8 p.m. Eastern, and I will see you there.